Sometimes the most effective thing a military can do isn't the loudest strike of the week. It's taking out the one piece of equipment the other side didn't realize was actually holding their entire strategy together. That's exactly what happened along Iran's southern coast this week. And I think it's genuinely one of the more clever moves of this entire war, precisely because of how little attention it initially got compared to the bigger strikes making headlines that same week. A lot of channels covering this war are going to keep chasing whichever single strike produces the most dramatic footage, and I understand why. That's what tends to perform well. But some of the smartest moves in any war are quiet by design, and I think this is exactly one of those moments. So let's actually slow down and give it the attention it deserves, rather than letting it get buried under headlines. I want to walk you through what actually happened, why this specific target mattered so much more than its size would suggest, and why Iran's own public claims in the days since have started falling apart under basic scrutiny. Every fact in this video comes from CENTCOM's own public statements, official U.S. Central Command social media posts, cross-checked reporting from multiple outlets, including Al Jazeera, CNN, the Jerusalem Post, and Israel National News, along with Iran's own state media, where it's directly relevant to compare claims. Where something is disputed between the two sides, I'll tell you clearly rather than picking a winner for you. Let's start with the target itself, because understanding exactly what it was is the entire key to understanding why this strike mattered. On July the 16th, U.S. forces destroyed a surveillance tower at Shahid Kalantari port in the city of Chabahar on Iran's Gulf of Oman coastline east of the Strait of Hormuz itself. CENTCOM confirmed the strike directly in a statement posted to its official account, describing the tower as part of a maritime surveillance network that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had used for decades to track and target commercial vessels transiting the strait. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth personally posted a photo of the destroyed tower afterward, and CENTCOM released 35 seconds of unclassified infrared footage showing the structure disappear inside a violent blast and a rolling plume of smoke. Here's why that specific description used for decades matters so much, and why I think this was a genuinely smart target choice rather than just another strike in a long list. A surveillance tower like this one isn't a weapon in the conventional sense. It doesn't fire anything itself, but it's the eyes at the very start of an entire targeting chain. It finds ships, it fixes their exact position, it tracks their movement over time, and then it feeds all of that information to IRGC commanders who use it to direct missiles, drones, or fast attack boats toward whatever vessel they've decided to target. A defense analysis of the strike put it about as cleanly as I've seen it described anywhere, saying the strike ripped one of the eyes out of the IRGC's maritime attack network. Whatever weapons Iran still has positioned near Hormuz after months of this war, they just lost a long-standing, reliable source of surveillance data covering the entire Gulf of Oman approach to the strait. CENTCOM was blunt about the human stakes involved too, stating directly that destroying this tower degrades the IRGC's ability to coordinate attacks on what it called innocent civilian crew members, tying this strike explicitly to protecting the actual mariners who have been caught in the middle of this conflict for months. Think about the tactical logic here for a second, because I think it's genuinely elegant. You can spend enormous resources chasing down every individual missile launcher, every fast boat hidden in a coastal cave, every drone site scattered across hundreds of miles of Iranian coastline. And that's exactly what much of this war's targeting has looked like up to this point. Or alternatively, you can go after the single node that lets Iran actually see where to aim all of those weapons in the first place, destroy the surveillance capability, and every downstream weapon system becomes considerably less effective, even if it survives completely physically intact because it no longer has reliable real-time data telling it where a target actually is. That's precisely the kind of target selection that produces outsized strategic effect relative to the physical size of what actually got destroyed. And it's a good example of exactly the sort of surgical high-leverage strike that a purely dramatic strike count can't fully capture on its own. There's a useful comparison here to how modern militaries think about targeting more broadly. Anyone who's studied air power doctrine will tell you that the most efficient strikes are rarely the ones that destroy the most physical mass. They're the ones that disable the fewest number of components needed to collapse an entire system's function. Think of it like disabling a car by pulling one specific wire rather than trying to destroy the whole engine block. The car still looks mostly intact, but it isn't going anywhere. A surveillance tower sitting at the head of a targeting chain is exactly that kind of single point of failure. Every missile battery, every fast boat, every drone launch site downstream of that tower still physically exists after the strike, fully armed and fully capable in isolation. But each of them is now operating with degraded situational awareness about where commercial traffic actually is at any given moment, which meaningfully reduces how effectively Iran can direct any of those remaining assets against a moving target in real time. There's also a genuinely new piece of military technology that entered this specific fight, And it's worth flagging directly because it's easy to miss inside a broader strike announcement. According to CENTCOM, this operation marked the first time one-way attack sea drones took part in this campaign. That's a real technological shift worth understanding. A one-way attack sea drone is essentially an unmanned surface vessel, packed with explosives and guided toward a target, functioning as a kind of naval equivalent to the one-way attack aerial drones that have become such a defining feature of modern warfare more broadly. Introducing that capability into the naval side of this specific campaign for the first time tells you the U.S. military has been actively expanding its toolkit against Iran's coastal targets throughout this war, rather than simply repeating the same strike profile month after month. It's worth spending a moment on why an unmanned maritime strike system matters strategically beyond just being an interesting new gadget. Sending a manned aircraft or a manned surface vessel into a heavily contested coastal area always carries real risk to the personnel aboard. And that risk shapes how aggressively commanders are willing to operate close to shore near mines, coastal defenses, and exactly the kind of hidden fast boats this war has spent months trying to root out. An unmanned system removes that specific constraint. It can be sent closer to shore into more contested water, accepting a higher risk of loss without any risk to human life, which in turn lets planners be considerably more aggressive about exactly which targets they're willing to go after and how close to Iran's own coastline they're willing to operate. Introducing that capability into the naval side of this campaign, even in a single operation, signals that American commanders are looking for ways to sustain and even increase the tempo of this specific fight without correspondingly increasing the risk to their own people, which is exactly the kind of shift that tends to matter more over the following weeks and months than in the single week it first appears. The broader strike package that included the Chabahar Tower reportedly lasted around 90 minutes altogether, and it coincided directly with the resumption of the American naval blockade against vessels transiting to or from Iranian ports, which CENTCOM said went into effect at 4 p.m. Eastern Time that same day. And the blockade enforcement wasn't just a policy statement sitting on paper somewhere either. CENTCOM released footage showing U.S. Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit conducting a verification boarding aboard a vessel called the MTWYO in the Gulf of Oman on the same day as the tower strike. That's the blockade actually functioning in real time. American forces physically boarding and inspecting a specific ship to verify compliance happening in parallel with the strike that had just blinded a chunk of Iran's coastal surveillance network. Put those two things together, degrading Iran's ability to track and target ships on one hand, while simultaneously and physically enforcing a blockade against Iran's own shipping on the other, and you start to see a genuinely coordinated campaign rather than a series of disconnected individual strikes. It's worth understanding exactly what a verification boarding like the one aboard the MTWYO actually involves, because the term itself undersells how significant an operation this is. It means a team of armed Marines physically leaves their own vessel, crosses open water, and climbs aboard a foreign-flagged commercial ship, inspecting cargo manifests, crew documentation, and the vessel's actual cargo against what it's declared to determine whether that ship is complying with the blockade or attempting to route goods to or from Iranian ports in violation of it. Every single one of those boardings carries real, non-trivial risk, not just from the possibility of resistance aboard the vessel itself, but from the basic fact that a small team of armed personnel operating far from their own ship in waters where Iranian fast boats and coastal defenses remain active even after months of strikes is inherently more exposed than personnel remaining aboard a heavily armed naval vessel. Doing that kind of boarding on the same day as a major strike against Iran's coastal surveillance network is a real demonstration of operational confidence. It tells you American commanders judged the immediate threat environment safe enough to conduct exactly the kind of close-in personnel-heavy operation that would have been considerably riskier before that surveillance capability got degraded. Now, let's talk about the rhetorical fight happening in parallel with all of this physical action, because I think it's just as important to the overall story, maybe even more revealing about where each side actually stands. A few days before the tower strike on July the 12th, CENTCOM put out a public statement that read almost like a direct rebuttal aimed squarely at Iran's own claims. The statement said plainly that the Strait of Hormuz is open to all vessels seeking to lawfully transit the international waterway, that U.S. forces are positioned and prepared to ensure freedom of navigation remains available despite what it called unwarranted Iranian aggression, harassment, threats, and arbitrary declarations. And then added two short, blunt lines that I think capture the entire tone of this specific rhetorical fight. Iran does not control the strait, and traffic is flowing. That statement is worth reading closely because it's directly contradicting a separate competing set of claims Iran had been making around the exact same window. Just days earlier, following the third round of U.S. strikes that week, Iran's IRGC had declared the strait closed entirely, stating it would remain closed until, in their words, the end of U.S. interference in this region. Iranian officials told their own state media that the U.S. military had been trying to create what they called an illegal route through the strait. And Iran claimed retaliatory attacks against 5 separate Gulf nations, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, and Oman, framing all of it as a direct response to renewed American strikes along its southern coast. So, you've got 2 governments making flatly contradictory public claims about the exact same stretch of water at essentially the same moment. Iran insisting the strait is closed and will stay closed until American forces leave the region, and the United States insisting the opposite, that the strait remains open. Iran doesn't actually control it, and traffic is moving through it, regardless of what Iran says. That's not a minor disagreement over interpretation. It's 2 governments each publicly asserting a version of physical reality that directly excludes the other's version. And I think that specific contradiction is actually the most useful lens for understanding the insane framing in this video's title. Not because either side did something wildly reckless in a purely tactical sense, but because the sheer confidence of the American statement, following almost immediately on the heels of Iran's own closure declaration, represents a level of open public defiance that's fairly unusual, even by this war's already escalated standards. The kind of statement that essentially dares the other government to prove otherwise in front of a watching world, rather than simply asserting a competing claim and letting the 2 versions sit unresolved side by side, the way so much of this conflict's public messaging has tended to unfold up to this point. There's an even more direct example of that same dynamic playing out just one day after the tower strike, and I think it's genuinely the clearest illustration of Iran's claims getting caught unprepared in real time. Following the strikes on July the 17th, the IRGC claimed it had attacked a U.S. Special Operations Command Center at Al-Tanf in Syria, and separately claimed to have captured or killed American soldiers there in retaliation. CENTCOM's response was about as direct a public rebuttal as you're likely to see in this entire conflict, stating flatly and immediately, fact, no U.S. troops in the region have recently been killed or captured. That's not diplomatic hedging or careful no comment. That's an explicit on-the-record denial of a specific enemy claim issued within the same news cycle the claim itself was made. Whether Iran's Al-Tanf claim was a deliberate fabrication meant to project strength domestically, a case of internal misinformation moving up through IRGC command channels, or some genuine but wildly exaggerated version of a minor incident, the fact that American forces felt confident enough to shoot it down this quickly and this bluntly tells you something real about how unprepared, or at least how sloppy, Iran's public messaging apparatus has become at exactly the moment its own physical capabilities were also visibly being degraded along the coast. It's worth being fair and balanced about the other side of this specific claim too, because Iranian state media didn't fully cave on every detail either. Iran's official news agency, IRNA, actually confirmed the destruction of the maritime control tower at Chabahar port after the U.S. strike, which is itself notable. Iran didn't try to deny that the tower itself had been hit, but IRNA's own reporting pushed back specifically on the broader scope of the damage, stating that the port's berths, cargo handling equipment, and other operational infrastructure remained unaffected by the strike. That's actually a pretty reasonable, credible-sounding rebuttal on Iran's part. A targeted strike against a specific surveillance tower wouldn't necessarily be expected to damage unrelated port infrastructure sitting elsewhere on the same site. And there's no obvious reason to doubt that specific claim the way there's reason to doubt the Al-Tanf story. That distinction matters because it shows Iran's state media wasn't uniformly unreliable in the aftermath of this specific week. It selectively confirmed what was true, the tower's destruction, while pushing back on what would have been an exaggeration, broader port damage, and separately put out what increasingly looks like an outright fabrication regarding Al-Tanf. Sorting through which parts of any government's wartime claims hold up and which don't is exactly the kind of careful work that gets skipped by channels chasing the loudest possible framing. And I think it's worth doing properly here. This is actually a really useful case study if you step back from it for a second in how to read wartime claims from any government more generally, not just in this specific conflict. The pattern here is almost a template. A claim about physical damage that's independently verifiable, like a tower being destroyed, tends to get confirmed by both sides because denying something that obviously happened only costs credibility for no benefit. A claim about the broader scope or significance of that damage, like whether an entire port's operations were affected, is where you start seeing genuine spin, each side shading the description toward whatever framing serves its narrative without necessarily crossing into outright fabrication. And then a claim about something considerably harder to independently verify in real time, like an alleged attack on a specific facility in a third country with alleged casualties, is exactly where you're most likely to see either significant exaggeration or outright invention, precisely because it's the hardest category of claim for outside observers to quickly check against physical evidence. Recognizing which category any specific claim falls into, verified physical fact, spun interpretation, or hard-to-verify assertion is genuinely the single most useful skill for following a war like this one without getting whipsawed by whichever side's messaging happens to reach you first on any given day. Let's zoom out and think about what this specific week actually tells you about the broader trajectory of the fight over the strait, because I don't think it's really about one single insane action. It's about a pattern that's been building for a while. This war's effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz technically dates back to March the 19th, when the United States began a sustained aerial campaign specifically aimed at destroying Iranian naval vessels and drones threatening shipping through the waterway following Iran's initial closure of the strait back on February the 28th. The same day, the broader war started with the strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader. Since then, you've had a naval blockade imposed in mid-April, a brief pause called Operation Project Freedom in early May, ongoing strikes throughout the summer, and a Congressional Research Service report noting that Iran's actual ability to mine or otherwise close the strait may have been substantially degraded by the cumulative weight of American and Israeli operations targeting exactly this kind of infrastructure since the war's opening days. The human cost across this entire campaign has been real, too, with tracked casualties including at least one tugboat sunk, more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, several abandoned outright, 2 merchant ships captured, and a dozen seafarers killed or missing, plus a port worker killed and 2 wounded in a separate incident in Bahrain. So, the Chabahar Tower strike isn't really a standalone, insane moment. It's the latest and arguably one of the more cleverly targeted entries in a 5-month campaign that's been grinding forward the entire time. It's worth pausing on those cumulative casualty figures for a second rather than just listing them and moving on, because they represent real people whose lives have been directly reshaped by a conflict most of them have no personal stake in whatsoever. A dozen seafarers killed or missing over the course of this campaign means a dozen families who've spent months not knowing or knowing the worst about someone who was simply doing a job moving cargo through a waterway that happened to become a war zone. Merchant crews aboard vessels transiting the strait come from dozens of different countries, and none of them signed up to be caught in the middle of a dispute between Washington and Tehran. Every strike, every blockade enforcement action, every surveillance tower taken offline in this campaign is ultimately being justified, at least in the official American framing, as protective of exactly those people. And it's worth holding CENTCOM's own stated rationale for the Chabahar strike protecting innocent civilian crew members against that actual human backdrop rather than treating it as pure rhetorical flourish. What actually makes this particular entry stand out, I think, is the combination of 3 things happening essentially simultaneously. A genuinely high-leverage target choice that degrades Iran's entire targeting chain rather than just one weapon system. The introduction of a brand new capability, one-way attack sea drones, into this specific fight for the first time. And a rhetorical environment where American officials are now willing to flatly and immediately contradict specific Iranian claims in real time rather than letting them sit unanswered. Taken together, that combination suggests a level of operational and informational confidence on the American side that's noticeably different from earlier phases of this war when Iranian claims about strikes and retaliation tended to circulate for longer before facing this kind of immediate specific pushback. I want to be careful here about what I'm not claiming because I don't want this video to overreach the way a title like this one is tempted to. I'm not telling you the Strait of Hormuz is now fully permanently open in some clean, settled sense. Both governments are still making competing claims about its actual status. And the shipping industry's own risk assessments, which I've covered in previous videos on this war, have continued to show real caution even during periods when American officials have declared the strait functionally open. I'm also not telling you Iran's entire coastal surveillance and strike network has been eliminated. A single tower, however significant, is one node in what CENTCOM itself described as a wider coastal network, meaning other surveillance assets almost certainly still exist along that coastline, even with this specific piece gone.